Why is America
not the greatest country in the world, Professor? That's my answer.
And with a straight face, you're going to tell students that America is so star-spangled awesome that we're the only ones in the world who have freedom? Canada has freedom. Japan has freedom. The UK, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Australia, Belgium has freedom. There is absolutely no evidence to support the statement that we're the greatest country in the world. We're 7th in literacy, 27th in math, 22nd in science, 49th in life expectancy, 178th in infant mortality, 3rd in median household income, number 4 in labor force, and number 4 in exports. We lead the world in only 3 categories: number of incarcerated citizens per capita, number of adults who believe angels are real, and defense spending, where we spend more than the next 26 countries combined.
The American government has not been very popular in the last 20 years. It was not always this way, as the US sent the first man to the moon, spawned inventions such as the telephone and airplane, and built the internet. But the last several decades have been marked with wars, financial meltdowns, and societal division not seen since the Civil War. Many Americans have been looking abroad for a better quality of life, and a country that commonly looks appealing is the landmass on the other side of the world, also founded in part by British outlaws. But how does Australia actually compare to the US? Is the grass really greener on the other side of the world?
With you because we love the video, but take us back to what was happening leading up to that moment.
Well, we'd been down at Options Tavern at a Stubbies and Singlets party, and got dropped off by a mate up the road and started to walk down the servo, get some noodles, and went to jump over a side on the way and slipped over and busted my plugger.
So Australia.
Busted a plugger.
Aussies are commonly stereotyped as outdoorsmen chasing kangaroos in the outback. But in reality, Australia is extremely cosmopolitan, and most of its citizens live in highly developed cities on the coast. Those stereotypical people are referred to as bogans, and they make up only a small portion of the population. According to the 2021 Global Livability Index, 4 Australian cities ranked in the top 10 most livable cities in the world, along with Kiwi, Japanese, and Swiss cities. There are no US cities that make this list, and there are a multitude of reasons that Aussie cities are considered more livable. The first major reason is the healthcare system. The US spends more money on healthcare per capita than any country in the world, by a long shot. This is true no matter which way you look at the numbers, including accounting for the GDP. The Commonwealth Foundation recently published a report ranking healthcare systems of 11 of the world's developed countries, and its methodology included access to healthcare, care process, administrative efficiency, equity, and healthcare outcomes. Australia's healthcare system was ranked 3rd behind Norway and the Netherlands, and the US was ranked dead last. The US had the highest levels of maternal mortality and avoidable deaths of any country, and the life expectancy is now declining. According to the report's methodology, the US was such a substantial outlier that it was negatively skewing the mean performance. Next is crime and poverty. The US has nearly 6 times the murder rate per capita of Australia and ranks right above Kenya. Australia, on the other hand, ranks lower than Denmark and Iceland. Along with culture and other factors, poverty is a major cause of this crime, as Australia has a 12.1% poverty rate compared to the 17.8% rate in the US. There is a common misconception that Australia achieves a lower poverty rate because it is more of a welfare state. However, it actually spends a bit less on social spending than the US. Instead, their success comes from education and wages. University in Australia is subsidized by the government, but students still pay a portion of the tuition. If they cannot afford it, they can get what is called a help loan to cover their portion of the tuition. Students don't need to pay back these loans until they reach the repayment threshold, which means that they are earning beyond a certain amount of income. In 2020, that number was about $46,000 per year. On the contrary, American public universities are nearly twice as expensive, and students must start paying back loans almost immediately after graduating. As a result, the student debt in the US is now closing in on $2 trillion. Australia's social spending costs have been drastically reduced by the fact that they have the second to highest minimum wage in the world, even adjusted for purchasing power parity, right behind Luxembourg. This is partially due to the historic strength of the unions, but it's also been ingrained in the national psyche for decades that everyone deserves a living wage. Unlike the US, no workers in Australia are dependent on tips, and the labor market is tight enough for the country to be able to import lots of foreign workers on working holiday visas and pay them good wages. Businesses also must pay their employees before paying for anything else, or else they will be shut down for trading while insolvent. Another major difference in Australia is that 30% of the workers are tradesmen, or tradies as they like to call them. In the US, trades are stigmatized as being lower-class jobs, and this has resulted in a major skills gap. All of these things have contributed to Australia's image of being a slower-paced, lower-stress, and more friendly place than the United States.
G'day. Mick Dundee from Australia. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. In town for a couple of days. I'll probably see you around.
Fine.
So how is it possible that Australians on average have a better quality of life than Americans by almost every significant metric? This is partially due to a different social contract that exists in Australia, but it's also largely due to Australia's resource boom. Similar to the way that oil has built up the Gulf countries in the Middle East. Around 2003, Australia began drastically mining and exporting more iron and coal in what has been referred to as a modern-day gold rush. Because of this, Australia avoided the 2008 global financial crisis and hadn't seen a recession in nearly 3 decades prior to COVID. While this resource boom has provided lots of opportunity for Australians, how does Australia compare to the United States as a whole in regards to being a land of opportunity?
I believe we can keep the promise of our founding. The idea that if you're willing to work hard, it doesn't matter who you are, or where you come from, or what you look like, or where you love. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white, or Hispanic or Asian, or Native American, or young or old, or rich or poor, able, disabled, gay or straight. You can make it here in America if you're willing to try.
American restaurants are a good microcosm of the country as a whole. Bartenders and servers often make less than $4 per hour, however, they can make hundreds of dollars from tips. I personally made over $700 in a single day. The ethos is that if you work hard and hustle, you will be rewarded. The flip side is that the cooks, expos, and everyone else working in the back of the house do not make tips, and the disparity between wages on a busy day is wildly unfair. Many of the highest paying jobs in the US are commission-based, so they have the same ethos of hard work and risk in exchange for potentially massive rewards. This is reflected in the numbers. The GDP per capita is about $10,000 to $15,000 higher in the US than in Australia, and this is also reflected in the mean household income. However, Australia ranks a bit higher in the median household income, meaning that while the US is much richer, even adjusted per capita, there is also much more wealth inequality. It's a similar story for the universities, as the US and the UK have the most expensive universities in the world. However, both countries dominate the top 25 rankings. The average salary of a Harvard graduate is nearly $90,000 per year, and it's safe to say that a degree from an American Ivy League university is a ticket to the upper middle class. The startup scene in the US is booming, as it has over 400 unicorns, which are privately held startup companies with a valuation of over $1 billion. Even adjusted per capita, the US has over 5 times as many unicorns as Australia and ranks 3rd in the world behind Israel and Singapore. Once again, this reinforces a common theme of risk-reward to succeed in the United States. But what about the biggest risks and the biggest rewards?
And Bonds hits one high. It's a deep. It is high.
Lillard, long-range three, and it's good!
It's going to get there. He turned 32 yesterday. Does he have a vintage moment in him? In the end zone, it is caught for the win!
The United States dominates the world when it comes to professional sports revenue, as its top 4 sports bring in over $35 billion, which is much more than Aussie rules football, even adjusted per capita. Hollywood is another area where the US dominates. Even though many American productions film in Australia and have Australian actors, Australia hasn't yet built up their domestic industry in the same way that India, Nigeria, and South Korea have. Innovation in the US isn't just a thing of the past, as the most influential companies such as Amazon, Apple, Google, SpaceX, and Tesla are all American. The US ranks number 3 in patents per capita behind Taiwan and Israel, and is typically also ranked number 3 in most innovative, behind Switzerland and Sweden. It doesn't seem like that is going to change anytime soon, as the US is at the forefront of the next generation of technological innovations, like blockchain, AI, and quantum computing.
This is the first experiment in self-government that actually worked, and it created the greatest superpower the world's ever known. It created the greatest cultural machine, the greatest machine of art and creativity and innovation right fucking here. And how did it do that? It did it through freedom. Because when you give people freedom, you let people do whatever the fuck they want to do, they actually find ways to succeed and grow and thrive.
It's important to ask, has the US ever really been free? Even though the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are still widely considered to be 2 of the most important documents ever written, they have frequently been directly violated. Not even 10 years into the American experiment, President John Adams criminalized making false statements against the federal government with his Alien and Sedition Acts. Widely considered to be one of the best presidents ever, Lincoln gave the military the power to arrest anyone who was even suspected of sympathizing with the South. When the Supreme Court tried to stop him, he said that there were 9 of them, but that he had an entire army. Woodrow Wilson passed something similar during World War I with the Espionage Act, which criminalized any disloyal language about the US government. Then Japanese Americans were put into internment camps during World War II. Movies were not protected under free speech until 1952. Then there was McCarthyism, the Pentagon Papers, the Patriot Act, Snowden and Assange, and now the lockdowns. Above all, there was the obvious hypocrisy of the Constitution proclaiming that all men were created equal during a time when slavery was legal. Today, several major stories that seem to contradict the idea of freedom are those about police brutality and kids in cages. But is Australia really that much better? As far as the kids in cages go, Australia doesn't have much of a better track record. For 15 years, asylum seekers were sent to the island nation of Nauru and kept in conditions that are probably worse than the ones on the southern border of the US. One refugee committed suicide by setting himself on fire to protest the living conditions. A psychologist named Paul Stevenson, who spent 40 years working with victims of terrorist attacks and natural disasters, said that Nauru was probably the worst atrocity that he had ever seen. Very few journalists were allowed on the island, and the government passed the Australian Border Force Act, which carries a prison sentence of up to 2 years for any staff member who speaks publicly about conditions inside of the camps. Unlike the US, Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights, and its constitution was written by the British monarchy. Because Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights, their freedoms are typically referred to as implied freedoms. A 1992 High Court case held that citizens had a right to freedom of expression, insofar as public and political discussion were concerned. Contrary to this, in 2019, the federal police in Sydney raided the offices of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation because they broadcasted a story from a whistleblower about the Australian military killing civilians in Afghanistan. The warrant that the police had allowed them to delete and alter any materials that the news organization had. Australia is commonly thought of as more of a nanny state than the US. For example, bartenders can be held personally liable for a patron that drinks too much in their bar. In that same vein, Australia's High Court recently ruled that media companies that post articles on Facebook can be held liable for the comments made on the articles by users. This is an attempt to crack down on libel and hate speech, as Australia is far more strict about this than the US. Now this brings us to COVID. Australia has had harsh lockdowns that have been brutally enforced by the police. In one case, several teenagers were arrested for sitting in a park. The most dystopian part of Australia's COVID response has been a facial recognition app that was created in South Australia. After citizens are randomly messaged on this app, they have 15 minutes to send proof that they are quarantining where they are supposed to be. If they cannot do this, the police will be sent to their house. Now, this is the point where the argument over guns gets brought up. In 1996, a massacre in Tasmania prompted the Australian government to launch a gun buyback program. Since then, the number of licensed gun owners has been cut in half, and now Australians own 3.5 million guns, which is about 1 gun per 7 or 8 people. There are also 260,000 guns on the black market. In contrast, it's estimated that the US has over 300 million guns, or roughly 1 gun per person. Unlike Australia, gun ownership in the US is protected under the Second Amendment, which was put into place as a mechanism for American citizens to protect themselves against a tyrannical government. In the COVID age, the idea of a tyrannical government has become much more real for many people. Last year, Reporters Without Borders ranked Australia number 25 in press freedom, and the US ranked 44th. The US also has the highest incarceration rate per capita in the entire world. By the numbers, Australia seems to be both more free and secure than the US. However, it will be interesting to see how these rankings will change post-COVID. On the whole, Australians have had it really good for the past 30 years. But the advantage that the US has is that its rights are enshrined, making it much more challenging for the government to seize power without resistance. Australia has implied rights, but its lack of a Bill of Rights gives them free rein to continue moving the goalposts on individual freedoms. When it comes to freedom, innovation, and quality of life, I think that there's plenty that the US and Australia can learn from each other. But I also think that both countries could improve on living up to the ideals of their own social contracts. That's the Zeitgeist, guys. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'm looking forward to hearing your opinions in the comments section. If you enjoy my content, make sure to give me a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one.